Okay, hello. Finishing chapter 30. Oh, my mic's far away. Finishing chapter 33. I left off on 775 at Hitler's belligerency and U.S. neutrality. I have a soda now. My plan is probably tomorrow. I'm probably gonna binge 34. But yeah, let me take a little sip. Ooh. I can't chew ice anymore. This sucks. Okay. Hitler's belligerency and U.S. neutrality. Joseph Stalin, the Sphinx of the Kremlin, was a key to the peace puzzle. In the summer of 1939, the British and French were busily negotiating with Moscow, hopefully of securing a mutual defense treaty that would halt Hitler. But mutual suspicions proved insuperable. Insuperable? Insuperable. Is that insuperable? A word. Then the Soviet Union astounded the world by signing on August 23rd, 1939, a non-aggression treaty with the German dictator. The notorious Hitler-Stalin pact meant that the Nazi German leader now had a green light to make war on Poland and the Western democracies without fearing a stab in the back from the Soviet Union, his communist archfoe. Consternation struck those wishful thinkers in Western Europe who had fondly hoped that Hitler might be seized upon Stalin so that the twin menaces would beat each other to death. It was as plain as the mustache on Stalin's face that the wily Soviet dictator was plotting to turn his German accomplice against the Western democracies. The two warring camps would then kill each other off and leave Stalin bestriding Europe like a colossus. With the signing of the Nazi-Soviet pact, World War II was only hours away. Hitler now demanded that neighboring Poland a return of the areas wrested from Germany after World War I. Failing to secure satisfaction, he sent his mechanized divisions crashing into Poland at dawn on September 1st, 1939. Britain and France, honoring their commitments to Poland, promptly declared war. At long last, they perceived the folly of contingent appeasement, but they were powerless to aid Poland, which succumbed in 3 weeks to Hitler's smashing strategy of terror. Stalin, as prearranged secretly in his fateful pact with Hitler, came in on the kill for his share of old Russian Poland. Long-dreaded World War II was now fully launched, and the long truce of 1919 and 1939 had come to an end. President Roosevelt speedily issued the routine proclamations of neutrality. The Americans were overwhelmingly anti-Nazi and anti-Hitler. They fervently hoped that the democracies would win. They fondly believed that the forces of righteousness would triumph, as in 1918, but they were desperately determined to stay out. They were not going to be suckers again. Neutrality promptly became a heated issue in the United States. Ill-prepared Britain and France urgently needed American airplanes and other weapons, but the Neutrality Act of 1937 raised a sternly forbidding hand. Roosevelt summoned Congress in special session shortly after the invasion of Poland to consider lifting the arms embargo. After 6 hectic weeks of debate, a makeshift law emerged. The Neutrality Act of 1939 provided that henceforth the European democracies might buy American war materials, but only on a cash-and-carry basis. This meant that they would have to transport their munitions in their own ships after paying for them in cash. America would thus avoid loans, war debts, and torpedoing of the American armed carriers. While Congress thus loosened former restrictions in response to interventionist cries, it added others in response to isolationist fears. Roosevelt was now also authorized to proclaim danger zones into which American merchant ships would be forbidden to enter. This unneutral neutrality law unfortunately hurt China, which was effectively blockaded by Imperial and Japanese Navy. But despite its defects, it clearly favored the European democracies against the dictators. As the British and French navies controlled the Atlantic, the European aggressors could not send their ships to buy American munitions. The United States not only improved its moral position, but simultaneously helped its economic position. Overseas demand for war goods brought a sharp upswing from the recession of 1937 to 1938, and ultimately solved the decade-long unemployment crisis. Excuse me. Okay. The fall of France. The months following the collapse of Poland, while France and Britain marked time, were known as the Phony War. An ominous silence fell on Europe as Hitler shifted his victorious divisions from Poland for a knockout blow at France. Inaction during this anxious period was relieved by the Soviets, who wantonly attacked neighboring Finland in an effort to secure strategic buffer territory. The debt-paying Finns, who had a host of admirers in America, were speedily granted $30 million by an isolationist Congress for non-military supplies. But despite heroic resistance, Finland was finally flattened by the Soviet steamroller. An abrupt end to the Phony War came in April 1940 when Hitler again, without warning, overran his weaker neighbors Denmark and Norway. Hardly pausing for breath, the next month he attacked Netherlands and Belgium, followed by a paralyzing blow at France. By late June, France was forced to surrender, but not until Mussolini had pounced on its rear for a jackal's share of the loot. In a pell-mell but successful evacuation from the French port of Dunkirk, the British managed to salvage the bulk of their shattered and partially disarmed army. The crisis providentially brought forth an inspired leader in Prime Minister Winston Churchill. The bulldog bulldog-jawed orator who nerved his people to fight off the fearful air bombings of their cities. France's sudden collapse shocked Americans out of their daydreams. Stout-hearted Britons, singing "There Will Always Be an England," were all that stood between Hitler and the death of the constitutional government in Europe. If Britain went under, Hitler would have at his disposal the workshops, shipyards, and slave labor of Western Europe. He might even have the powerful British fleet as well. This frightening possibility, which seemed to pose a dire threat to American security, steeled the American people to a tremendous effort. Roosevelt moved with electrifying energy to dispatch. He called upon an already debt-burdened nation to build huge air fleets and a two-ocean navy, which could also check Japan. Congress, jarred out of its apathy toward preparedness, within a year appropriated the astounding sum of $37 billion. This figure was more than the total cost of fighting World War I and about 5 times larger than any New Deal annual budget. Congress also passed a conscription law, approved September 6, 1940. Under this measure, America's first peacetime draft provision was made for training each year 1.2 million troops and 800,000 reserves. The act was later adapted to the requirements of a global war. The Latin American bulwark likewise needed bracing. The Netherlands, Denmark, and France, all crushed under the German jackboot, had orphaned colonies in the New World. Would these fall into German hands? At the Havana Conference of 1940, the United States agreed to share with its 20 New World neighbors the responsibility of upholding the Monroe Doctrine. This ancient dictum, hitherto unilateral, had been a bludgeon brandished only in the hated Yankee fist. Now multilateral, it was to be wielded by 21 pairs of American hands, at least in theory. Ooh, I dropped my water bottle. And also my napkin. Oh my goodness gracious, I'm making a mess. Refugees from the Holocaust. Aroused by Adolf Hitler, the ancient demon of anti-Semitism brutally bared its fangs. During the late 19th century, Jewish communities in Eastern Europe were frequent victims of pogroms, mob attacks approved or condoned by local authorities. In modern Germany, primeval violence reappeared with shocking efficiency on the night of November 9, 1938, instigated by a speech by Nazi propagandist Joseph Goebbels. Mobs ransacked more than 7,000 Jewish shops and almost all of the country's synagogues. At least 91 Jews lost their lives, and about 30,000 were sent to concentration camps in the turbulent wake of Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Many Jews attempted to escape from Hitler's racist juggernaut. To take one poignant case, in May 1939, 937 passengers, almost all of them Jewish refugees, boarded the ship St. Louis in Hamburg and departed for Havana. When they reached Cuba, however, most were denied entry for lack of a valid Cuban visa. The St. Louis then sailed to Miami, which proved no more hospitable. President Roosevelt briefly showed some interest in accepting the beleaguered passengers, but restrictive immigration laws, together with opposition from Southern Democrats and Secretary of State Cordell Hull, convinced him otherwise. After being turned away one last time in Canada, the St. Louis eventually deposited its passengers in England, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, where many of them subsequently perished under the Nazi heel. After reports of the Nazi genocide began to be verified in 1942, Roosevelt created the War Refugee Board, which saved thousands of Hungarian Jews from deportation to the notorious death camp at Auschwitz. But all told, only 150,000 Jews, mostly Germans and Austrians, found refuge in the United States. By the end of the war, some 6 million Jews had been murdered by the Holocaust. Excuse me. Sorry, I'm like my throat is like, anyways, bolstering Britain. Before the fall of France in June 1940, Washington had generally observed a technical neutrality. But now, as Britain alone stood between Hitler and his dream of world domination, the wisdom of neutrality seemed increasingly questionable. Hitler launched air attacks against Britain in August 1940, preparatory to an invasion scheduled for September. For months, the Battle of Britain raged in the air over the British Isles. The Royal Air Force's tenacious defense of native islands eventually led Hitler to postpone his planned invasion indefinitely. During the precarious months of the Battle of Britain, debate intensified in the United States over what foreign policy to embrace. Radio broadcasts from London brought the drama of the nightly German air raids directly into millions of American homes. Sympathy for Britain grew, but it was not yet sufficient to push past the United States into war. Roosevelt faced a historic decision, whether to hunker down in the Western Hemisphere, assume a Fortress America defensive posture, and let the rest of the world go it alone, or to bolster beleaguered Britain by all means short of war itself. Both sides had their advocates. The supporters obeyed to Britain foreign propaganda groups, the most potent of which was the Committee to Defend America by Aiding the Allies. Its argument was double-barreled. To interventionists, it could appeal for direct succor to British by such slogans as "Britain is fighting our fight." To isolationists, it could appeal for assistance to democracies by all methods short of war, so that the terrible conflict would be kept in faraway Europe. The isolationists, both numerous and sincere, were by no means silent. Determined to avoid American bloodshed at all costs, they organized the America First Committee and proclaimed England will fight to the last American. They contended that America should concentrate what strength it had to defend its own shores, lest a victorious Hitler, after crushing Britain, plot a transoceanic assault. Their basic philosophy was the Yanks are not coming, and their most effective speechmaker was the famed aviator Colonel Charles A. Lindbergh, who ironically admired the Atlantic in 1927. Britain was in critical need of destroyers, for German submarines were again threatening to starve it out with attacks on shipping. Roosevelt moved boldly when, on September 2, 1940, he agreed to transfer to Great Britain 50 old Model 4 funnel destroyers left over from World War I. In return, the British promised to hand over to the United States 8 valuable defensive base sites, stretching from Newfoundland to South America. These strategically located outposts were to remain under the Stars and Stripes for 99 years. Transferring 50 destroyers to a foreign navy was a legally questionable disposal of government property. The exchange was achieved by a simple presidential agreement, without so much as a by your leave to Congress. Applause burst from the Aid to Britain advocates, many of whom had been urging such a step, but condemnation arose from America Firsters and other isolationists, as well as from anti-administration Republicans. Some of them approved the transfer, but decried Roosevelt's secretive and arbitrary methods. Yet so grave was the crisis that the president was unwilling to submit the scheme to the uncertainties and delays of a full-dress debate in Congress. Shifting warships from a neutral United States to a belligerent Britain was beyond question a flagrant violation of neutral obligations, at least neutral obligations that had existed before Hitler's barefaced aggressions rendered foolish such old-fashioned concepts of fair play. Public opinion polls demonstrated that a majority of Americans were determined, even at the risk of armed hostilities, to provide the battered British with all aid short of war. My throat is so messed up. Shattering the two-term tradition. A distracting presidential election, as fate decreed, came in the midst of this crisis. The two leading Republican aspirants were round-faced and flat-voiced Senator Robert A. Taft of Ohio, son of the ex-president, and the energetic boy wonder, lawyer prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey of New York. But on one of the miracles of American political history, for the Philadelphia Convention was swept off its feet by a colorful latecomer, Wendell L. Willkie, a German-descended son of Hoosier, Indiana. This dynamic lawyer, tousle-headed, long-lipped, and broad-faced, and large-framed, had until recently been a Democrat and the head of a huge public utility corporation. A complete novice in politics, he had rocketed from the political nothingness in a few short weeks. His great appeal lay in his personality, for he was magnetic, transparently trustful, and an honest and a homespun Lincoln-esque way. With the galleries in Philadelphia widely chanting, "We want Willkie," the delegates finally accepted this political upstart as the only candidate who could possibly beat Roosevelt. The Republican platform condemned FDR's alleged dictatorship, as well as the costly and confusing zigzags of the New Deal. Willkie, an outspoken liberal, was opposed not so much to the New Deal as to his extravagancies and inefficiencies. Democratic critics branded him the rich man's Roosevelt and the simple barefoot Wall Street lawyer. While the rumor pot boiled, Roosevelt delayed to the last minute the announcement of his decisions to challenge the sacred two-term tradition. Despite what he described as his personal yearning for retirement, he vowed that in so grave a crisis he owed his experienced hand to service of his country and humanity. The Democratic delegates in Chicago, realizing that only with the champ could they defeat Willkie, drafted him by a technically unanimous vote. Better a third term than a third-rater, was the war cry of many Democrats. Burning with sincerity and energy, Willkie launched out upon a whirlwind, Bryan-esque campaign in which he delivered over 500 speeches. At times his voice became a hoarse croak. The country was already badly split between interventionists and isolationists, and Willkie might have widened the breach dangerously by a violent attack on Roosevelt's aid to Britain policies. But seeing eye to eye with FDR and the necessity of bolstering the beleaguered democracies, he refrained from assailing the president's interventionism, though objecting to his methods. In the realm of foreign affairs, there was not much to choose between the two candidates. Both promised to stay out of the war, both promised to strengthen our nation's defenses, yet Willkie, with a mop of black hair in his eyes, hit hard at the Rooseveltian dictatorship with the third term. His enthusiastic followers cried, "Win with Willkie, no fourth term either, and there's no indispensable man." Roosevelt, busy at his desk with mounting problems, made only a few speeches. Stung by taunts that he was leading the nation by the back door into the European slaughterhouse, he repeatedly denied any such intention. His most specific statement was at Boston, where he emphatically declared, "Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars," a pledge that later came back to plague him. He and his supporters vigorously defended the New Deal, as well as all-out preparations for the defense of America and aid to the Allies. Roosevelt triumphed, although Wilkie ran a strong race. The popular total was 27 million to 22 million, and the electoral count was 449 to 82. This contest was much less of a walkway than in 1932 or 1936. Democratic majorities in Congress remained about the same. Jubilant Democrats hailed their triumph as a mandate to abolish the two-term tradition. But the truth is that Roosevelt won in spite of the third-term handicap. Voters generally felt that the war should come. The experienced hand of the tried leader was needed at the helm. Less appealing was the completely inexperienced hand of the well-intentioned Wilkie, who had never held public office. The time-honored argument that one should not change horses in the middle of a stream was strong, especially in an era of war-pumped prosperity. Roosevelt might not have won if there had not been a war crisis. On the other hand, he probably would not have run if foreign perils had not loomed so ominously. In a sense, his opponent was Adolf Hitler, not Wilkie. I think you can hear my voice getting raspy as I not drink for a while. A landmark Lend-Lease law. By late 1940, embattled Britain was nearing the end of its financial tether. Its credits in America were being rapidly consumed by insatiable war orders. But Roosevelt, who had bitter memories of the wrangling over the Allied debts of World War I, was determined, as he put it, to eliminate the silly, foolish old dollar sign. He finally hit on the scheme of lending or leasing American arms to the reeling democracies. When the shooting war was over, to use his comparison, the guns and tanks could be returned, just as one's next-door neighbor would return a garden hose when a threatening fire was put out. But isolationist Senator Taft, who was reputed to have the finest mind in Washington until he made it up, retorted that lending arms was like lending chewing gum. You don't want it back. Who wants a chewed-up tank? The Lend-Lease Bill, patriotically numbered in 1776, was entitled An Act further to promote the defense of the United States. Sprung on the country after the election was safely over, it was praised by the administration as a device that would keep the nation out of the war rather than drag it in. The underlying concept was send guns, not sons, or billions, not bodies. America, so President Roosevelt promised, would be the arsenal of democracy. It would send a limitless supply of arms to the victims of aggression, who in turn would finish the job and keep the war on their side of the Atlantic. Accounts would be settled by returning the used weapons or equivalents to the United States when the war was ended. Lend-Lease was heatedly debated throughout the land and in Congress. Most of the opposition came, as it might be expected, from isolationists and anti-Roosevelt Republicans. The scheme was assailed as the blank check bill, and, in the words of isolationist Senator Burton Wheeler, as the new AAA Agricultural Adjustment Act bill, a measure designed to plow under every fourth American boy. Nevertheless, Lend-Lease was finally approved in March 1941 by sweeping majorities in both houses of Congress. Lend-Lease is one of the most momentous laws ever to pass Congress. It was a challenge hurled squarely into the teeth of the Axis dictators. America pledged itself to the extent of its vast resources to bolster those nations that were indirectly defending it by fighting aggression. When the gigantic operation ended in 1945, America had sent about $50 billion worth of arms and equipment, much more than the cost of the country of World War I, to those nations fighting aggressors. The passing of the Lend-Lease was in effect an economic declaration of war. Now, a shooting declaration could not be very far around the corner. By its very nature, the Lend-Lease Bill marked the abandonment of any pretense of neutrality. It was no destroyer deal arranged privately by President Roosevelt. The bill was universally debated over drugstore counters and Cracker Barrels from California all the way to Maine, and the sovereign citizen at last spoke through convincing majorities in Congress. Most people probably realized that they were tossing the old concepts of neutrality out the window, but they also recognized that they would play a suicidal game if they bound themselves to the ox cart rules of the 19th century, especially while the Axis aggressors themselves openly spurred international obligations. Lend-Lease would admittedly involve a grave risk of war, but most Americans were prepared to take that chance rather than see Britain collapse and then face the diabolical dictators alone. Lend-Lease had the somewhat incidental result of gearing U.S. factories for all-out war production. The enormously increased capacity thus achieved helped save Americans' own skin when, at long last, the shooting war burst around its head. Hitler evidently recognized Lend-Lease as unofficial declaration of war. Until then, Germany had avoided attacking U.S. ships. Memories of America's decisive intervention in 1917-18 were still fresh in German minds, but after the passing of Lend-Lease, there was less point in trying to curry favor with the United States. On May 21, 1941, the Robin Moore, an unarmed American merchantman, was torpedoed and destroyed by a German submarine in the South Atlantic, outside a war zone. The sinkings had started, but on a limited scale. Charting a new world. Two globe-shaking events marked the course of World War II before the assault on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. One was the fall of France in June 1940. The other was Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, almost exactly 1 year later in June 1941. The scheming dictators Hitler and Stalin had been uneasy yokefellows under the ill-begotten Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939. As masters of the double cross, neither trusted the other. They engaged in prolonged dickering in a secret attempt to divide potential territorial spoils between them, but Stalin balked at dominant German control of the Balkans. Hitler thereupon decided to crush his co-conspirator, seize the oil and other resources of the Soviet Union, and then have two free hands to snuff out Britain. He assumed that his invincible armies would subdue Stalin's Mongol half-wits in a few short weeks. Out of a clear sky on June 22, 1941, Hitler launched a devastating attack on his Soviet neighbor. This timely assault was an incredible stroke of good fortune for the democratic world, or so it seemed at the time. The two fiends could now slit each other's throats in the icy steppes of Russia, or they would if the Soviets did not quickly collapse, as many military experts had predicted. Sound American strategy seemed to dictate speedy aid to Moscow while it was still afloat. Roosevelt immediately promised assistance and backed up his words by making some military supplies available. Several months later, interpreting the Lend-Lease Law to mean that the defense of the USSR was now essential for the defense of the United States, he extended $1 billion in Lend-Lease, the first installment on an ultimate total of $11 billion. Meanwhile, the valor of the Red Army, combined with the white paralysis of an early Russian winter, had halted Hitler's invaders at the gates of Moscow. With the surrender of the Soviet Union still a dread possibility, the drama-charged Atlantic Conference was held in August 1941. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, with a cigar embedded in his cherubic face, secretly met with Roosevelt on a warship off the foggy coast of Newfoundland. This was the first of a series of history-making conferences between the two statesmen for the discussion of common problems, including the menace of Japan and the Far East. The most memorable offspring of this get-together was the 8-Point Atlantic Charter. It was formally accepted by Roosevelt and Churchill and endorsed by the Soviet Union later that year. Suggestive of Wilson's 14 points, the new covenant outlined the aspirations of democracy for a better world at war's end. Arguing for the rights of individuals rather than nations, the Atlantic Charter laid the groundwork for later advocacy on behalf of universal human rights. Many were surprised by how specific the document was. Opposing imperialistic annexations, the Charter promised that there would be no territorial changes contrary to the wishes of the inhabitants, self-determination. It further affirmed the right of the people to choose their own form of government and, in particular, to regain the governments abolished by the dictators. Among various other goals, the Charter declared for disarmament and a peace of security, pending a permanent system of general security, a new League of Nations. Liberals the world over took heart from the Atlantic Charter, as they had taken heart from Wilson's comparable 14 points. It was especially gratifying to subject populations like the Poles who were being grounded on the iron heel of a conqueror. But the agreement was roundly condemned in the United States by isolationists and others hostile to Roosevelt. What right, they charged, had neutral America to confer with belligerent Britain on common policies? Such critics missed the point. The nation was in fact no longer neutral. U.S. destroyers and Hitler's U-boats clash. Lend-Lease shipments of arms to Britain on British ships were bound to be sunk by German Wolfpack submarines. If the intent was to get the munitions to England, not to dump them into the ocean, the freighters would have to be escorted by U.S. warships. Britain simply did not have enough destroyers. The dangerous possibility of being convoyed into war had been mentioned in Congress during the lengthy debate on Lend-Lease, but administration spokespeople had brushed the idea aside. Their strategy was to make only one commitment at a time. Roosevelt made the fateful decision to convoy in July 1941. By virtue of his authority as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, the President issued orders to the Navy to escort Lend-Lease shipments as far as Iceland. The British would then shepherd them the rest of the way. Inevitable clashes with submarines ensued on the Iceland run, even though Hitler's orders were to strike at American warships only in self-defense. In September 1941, the U.S. destroyer Greer, provocatively trailing a German U-boat, was attacked by the undersea craft without damage to either side. Roosevelt then proclaimed a shoot-on-sight policy. On October 17th, the escorting destroyer Kearney, while engaged in a battle with U-boats, lost 11 men when it was crippled but not sent to the bottom. 2 weeks later, the destroyer Reuben James was torpedoed and sunk off southwestern Iceland, with the loss of more than 100 officers and enlisted men. Neutrality was still inscribed on the statute books, but not in American hearts. Congress, responding to public pressures and confronted with a shooting war, voted in mid-November 1941 to pull the teeth from the now useless Neutrality Act of 1939. Oh my god. Did you just hear my dog? I'm so sorry. Merchant ships could henceforth be legally armed, and they could enter the combat zones with munitions from Britain. Americans braced themselves for wholesale attacks by Hitler's submarines. Surprise assault on Pearl Harbor. The blow-up came not in the Atlantic, but in the faraway Pacific. This explosion should have surprised no close observer, for Japan, since September 1940, had been a formal military ally of Nazi Germany, America's shooting foe in the North Atlantic. Japan's position in the Far East had grown more perilous by the hour. It was still mired down in the costly and exhausting China incident from which it could extract neither honor nor victory. Its war machine was fatally dependent on immense shipments of steel, scrap iron, oil, and aviation gasoline from the United States. Such assistance to the Japanese aggressor was highly unpopular in America. But Roosevelt had resolutely held off on embargo, lest he goad the Tokyo warlords into a descent upon the oil-rich but defense-poor Dutch East Indies. Oh, excuse me, that was gross. Washington, late 1940, finally imposed the first of its embargoes on Japan-bound supplies. This blow was followed in mid-1941 by a freezing of Japanese assets in the United States and a cessation of all shipments of gasoline and other sinews of war. As the oil gauge dropped, the squeeze on Japan grew steadily more nerve-wracking. Japanese leaders were faced with two painful alternatives. They could either knuckle under the Americans or break out of the embargo ring by a desperate attack on the oil supplies and other riches of Southeast Asia. Final tense negotiations with Japan took place in Washington during November and early December of 1941. The State Department insisted that the Japanese clear out of China, but to sweeten the pill, offered to renew trade regulations on a limited basis. Japanese imperialists, after waging a bitter war against the Chinese for more than 4 years, were unwilling to lose face by withdrawing at the behest of the United States. Faced with capitulation or continued conquest, they chose the sword. Officials in Washington having cracked the top-secret code of the Japanese knew that Tokyo's decision was for war, but the United States, as a democracy committed to the public debate and action by Congress, could not shoot first. Roosevelt, misled by Japanese ship movements in the Far East, evidently expected the blow to fall on British Malaya or on the Philippines. No one in high authority in Washington seems to have believed that the Japanese were either strong enough or foolhardy enough to strike Hawaii. But the paralyzing blow struck Pearl Harbor. That was an awful... I just pronounced Pearl so bad. But the paralyzing blow struck Pearl Harbor, while Tokyo was deliberately prolonging negotiations in Washington. Japanese bombers, bringing in distant aircraft carriers, attacked without warning on the Black Sunday morning of December 7, 1941. It was a date, as Roosevelt told Congress, which will live in infamy. But about 3,000 casualties were inflicted in American personnel. Many aircraft were destroyed, the battleship fleet was virtually wiped out when all 8 of the craft were sunk and otherwise immobilized, and numerous small vessels were damaged or destroyed. Fortunately for America, the 3 priceless aircraft carriers happened to be outside of the harbor. An angered Congress the next day officially recognized that the war had been thrust upon the United States. The roll call in the Senate and House fell only 1 vote short of unanimity. Germany and Italy, allies of Japan, spared Congress the indecision of debate by declaring war on December 11, 1941. This challenge was formally accepted on the same day by a unanimous vote of both Senate and House. The unofficial war, already of many months' duration, was now official. America's transformation from bystander to belligerent. Japan's hard-carried gamble in Hawaii paid off only in the short run. True, the Pacific Fleet was largely destroyed or immobilized, but the sneak attack aroused and united America as almost nothing else could have done. To the very day of the blow-up, a strong majority of Americans still wanted to keep out of the war, but the bombs that pulverized Pearl Harbor blasted the isolationists into silence. The only thing left to do, growled isolationist Senator Wheeler, was to lick hell out of them. But Pearl Harbor was not the full answer to the question of why the United States went to war. This treacherous attack was but the last explosion in a long chain reaction. Following the fall of France, Americans were confronted with a devil's dilemma. They desired above all to stay out of the conflict, yet they did not want Britain to be knocked out. They wished to halt Japan's conquest in the Far East, conquest that menaced not only American trade and security, but international peace as well. To keep Britain from collapsing, the Roosevelt administration felt compelled to extend the unneutral aid that invited attacks from German submarines. To keep Japan from expanding, Washington undertook to cut off vital Japanese supplies with embargoes that invited possible retaliation. Rather than let democracy die and dictatorship rule supreme, most citizens were evidently determined to support a policy that might lead to war. It did. World War II. Okay. Cool. Oh, my microphone. Okay, cool. Yeah. Chapter 33. Whew, I'm gonna pass out. Yay.